The letter in Eleanor Webb's trembling hands promised salvation, but the dust-choked streets of Las Vegas, New Mexico territory, in the summer of 1878 whispered only of judgment and scorn. She stepped down from the stagecoach with nothing but a worn carpetbag and the carefully folded correspondence that had brought her across 3 states. The afternoon sun beat mercilessly on the packed dirt Main Street, and Eleanor could feel curious eyes following her every movement. A woman traveling alone always drew attention, but a woman arriving to marry a man she had never met in person drew something more dangerous: speculation. The marriage broker in St. Louis had assured her that Mr. Cornelius Whitmore was a prosperous merchant, a respected member of the community, and a widower seeking a proper wife to manage his household. Eleanor had accepted his proposal not out of romantic notions, but out of stark necessity. Her father's death 6 months prior had left her destitute, and her only living relative, an aunt in Philadelphia, had made it abundantly clear that Eleanor's continued residence in her home was an imposition she could barely tolerate. Eleanor was 22 years old, educated enough to read and write with skill, and possessed of what her late mother had called a sensible disposition. She was not beautiful in the classical sense, but her features were pleasant, her brown hair thick and manageable, and her green eyes reflected intelligence and determination. She had convinced herself that a marriage of practical arrangement could become, over time, something resembling companionship if not love. The Las Vegas Plaza Hotel stood 2 stories tall, its adobe walls painted white and its wooden balcony shaded by a faded awning. Eleanor made her way inside, grateful for the relative coolness of the interior. The lobby was sparsely furnished but clean, and the clerk behind the desk, a thin man with spectacles perched on his narrow nose, regarded her with polite curiosity. "I am Eleanor Webb," she said, setting her carpetbag down. "I have traveled here at the invitation of Mr. Cornelius Whitmore. He was to meet me here this afternoon." The clerk's expression shifted from curiosity to something Eleanor could not quite identify, pity, perhaps, mixed with discomfort. "Miss Webb, I am afraid I must be the bearer of unfortunate news," he said carefully. "Mr. Whitmore passed away 4 days ago. A sudden apoplexy, the doctor said. It was very quick." The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself, her mind racing through the implications. She had spent every cent she possessed on the journey west. She had no family to return to, no prospects, no means of supporting herself in a strange town where she knew no one. "I see," she managed to say, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Thank you for informing me. Miss Webb, if I might suggest," the clerk said hesitantly, "Reverend Carmichael at the First Presbyterian Church has been known to assist travelers in difficult circumstances. Perhaps he might offer some guidance." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak further. She collected her bag and walked back into the harsh sunlight, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had turned to sand. The church was a modest wooden structure at the end of the main street, painted white with a simple cross mounted above the door. Eleanor climbed the 3 steps to the entrance and knocked. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a man in his late 50s, with silver hair and a stern, weather-beaten face. "Reverend Carmichael?" Eleanor asked. "I am he," the Reverend replied, his voice formal and measured. "How may I be of service?" Eleanor explained her situation as concisely as she could, watching the Reverend's expression grow increasingly disapproving as she spoke. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his thin lips pressed into a firm line. "You traveled across the country to marry a man you had never met," he said finally, and there was unmistakable censure in his tone. This is the consequence of such reckless and improper behavior, Miss Webb. The Lord does not bless arrangements that circumvent His natural order. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with anger and humiliation. I had little choice in the matter, Reverend. I was facing destitution. There are always choices, Miss Webb. Prayer, faith, and trust in the Lord's provision are the proper responses to hardship, not hasty arrangements with strangers. He sighed heavily. However, I am not without Christian charity. There is a boarding house run by Mrs. Beatrice Patterson. She occasionally has need of assistance with her household duties. I will write you a letter of introduction, though I cannot promise she will have work for you. Thank you, Reverend, Eleanor said quietly, accepting the letter he produced and quickly penned. I must warn you, however, Reverend Carmichael added as she turned to leave. Las Vegas is a town with certain expectations regarding propriety and moral conduct. A young woman alone, without family or proper connections, will be the subject of scrutiny. I strongly suggest you conduct yourself with the utmost discretion and attend services each Sunday. The appearance of godliness is as important as godliness itself in maintaining one's reputation. Eleanor left the church feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The Reverend's words stung not because they were cruel, exactly, but because they underscored the precariousness of her position. In this time and place, a woman without male protection or family connections was vulnerable in ways both practical and social. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a large adobe building on a side street, with a well-maintained garden and curtains in every window. The proprietress herself was a woman in her 60s, stout and capable-looking, with sharp eyes that seemed to assess Eleanor in a single glance. "The Reverend sent you, did he?" Mrs. Patterson said, reading the letter of introduction. "Well, I suppose he means well, though I have my own standards for who I employ. Can you cook?" "Yes, madam. My mother taught me. Laundry?" "Yes, madam. Can you read and write? Keep accounts?" "I can, madam. I attended school through the 8th grade and helped my father with his business correspondence before he passed." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "That is more education than most young women possess. Very well, Miss Webb. I can offer you room and board in exchange for assisting with the cooking, cleaning, and laundry. I have 6 regular boarders and occasionally take in travelers. The work is hard, and I expect it done properly. In addition to your keep, I will pay you $3 a month in coin. It is not generous, but it is fair." "I accept with gratitude, Mrs. Patterson," Eleanor said, relief flooding through her. And so Eleanor Webb found herself beginning a new life she had never imagined, far from everything she had known, in a dusty New Mexico town that seemed determined to remind her at every turn that she did not belong. The days fell into a rhythm of endless work. Eleanor rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the boarders, spent the morning on laundry or cleaning, helped with the midday meal, and occupied her afternoon with mending, ironing, or whatever other tasks Mrs. Patterson assigned. The work was exhausting, and Eleanor fell into bed each night too tired to dwell on the uncertainty of her situation. The boarders were a varied group. There was Mr. Hoskins, an elderly gentleman who had been a surveyor in his younger days and now lived on a small pension. The Garrett brothers, miners who spent weeks at a time in the hills and returned to town smelling of earth and sweat. Mr. Liu, who ran a laundry service and spoke English with a heavy accent that Eleanor strained to understand. And then there was Quincy Shepherd. Eleanor first met Quincy Shepherd on her 3rd day at the boarding house. She was carrying a basket of fresh linens upstairs when a door opened suddenly, and she nearly collided with a tall man emerging from one of the rooms. "Pardon me, miss," he said, steadying her with one hand. "Did not mean to startle you." Eleanor looked up and found herself meeting a pair of striking blue eyes. Quincy Shepherd was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that fell just past his collar. He was dressed in work clothes, denim trousers, and a simple cotton shirt, and there was a quiet strength in his bearing that immediately set him apart from the other boarders. "No harm done," Eleanor said, stepping back. "I should have been more careful. You are Mrs. Patterson's new helper," Quincy observed. "Welcome to the establishment. I am Quincy Shepherd. I work at the Double S Ranch about 10 miles north of town." "Eleanor Webb," she replied. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Shepherd. Just Quincy is fine, Miss Webb. We are not particularly formal folk out here." He smiled, and there was genuine warmth in the expression. "If you need anything, or if any of the other boarders give you trouble, you let me know. Mrs. Patterson runs a respectable house, and she would not take kindly to any impropriety." "Thank you, Mr. Shepherd. I mean Quincy." Eleanor felt herself blushing slightly under his direct gaze and chided herself for the reaction. The last thing she needed was to develop any sort of attachment to a cowboy boarder. Quincy tipped his hat and headed downstairs, leaving Eleanor to continue her work with her thoughts in unexpected disarray. Over the following weeks, Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of Quincy's presence in the boarding house. He was different from the other men. He spoke courteously to everyone, helped Mrs. Patterson with heavy lifting without being asked, and had a gentle manner that seemed at odds with the rough work of a ranch hand. He read books in the evening, Eleanor noticed, real books with leather bindings, and sometimes she would catch him writing in a journal by lamplight. Quincy, for his part, found his attention drawn to Eleanor Webb in ways he had not anticipated. There was something in the set of her shoulders, a determination mixed with vulnerability that struck a chord deep within him. He had heard the story of her arrival in town, of course. Las Vegas was too small for such things to remain secret. He knew that she had come to marry a dead man, and he knew that Reverend Carmichael had made his disapproval of her situation abundantly clear from the pulpit, though without mentioning her by name. What Quincy admired was that Eleanor had not crumbled under the weight of her circumstances. She worked hard, kept her dignity, and faced each day with quiet courage. He began to look forward to meals at the boarding house, to the brief exchanges when their paths crossed, to the sound of her voice as she spoke with Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen. It was 6 weeks after Eleanor's arrival that circumstances brought them into closer contact. Mrs. Patterson's sister in Santa Fe fell ill, and the proprietress had to make an immediate journey to care for her. She left Eleanor in charge of the boarding house with strict instructions and a promise to return within 10 days. "I am trusting you, Miss Webb," Mrs. Patterson said as she prepared to depart. "Mr. Hoskins and Quincy will be here if you need assistance with anything requiring a man's hand, but the daily running of the house will fall to you. I have confidence in your abilities." Eleanor felt both proud and terrified. She had never managed an entire household on her own, but she was determined not to disappoint Mrs. Patterson's trust. The first few days went smoothly enough. Eleanor rose even earlier than usual, prepared meals, managed the cleaning and laundry, and handled the accounts. The boarders were cooperative, and Mr. Hoskins proved particularly helpful, assisting with minor repairs and advising her on various household matters. It was on the 4th day that trouble arrived in the form of 3 cowboys from a neighboring ranch, the Circle K. They came looking for rooms, and Eleanor, remembering that Mrs. Patterson often took in temporary boarders for extra income, agreed to rent them 2 rooms for 3 nights. The men seemed pleasant enough at first. They paid in advance, thanked Eleanor politely, and settled into their accommodations. But by evening, It became clear that they had been drinking, and their behavior grew increasingly boisterous. They made loud comments at supper, laughed raucously at jokes that made Eleanor uncomfortable, and one of them, a burly man with a thick red beard, stared at her in a way that made her skin crawl. After the meal, Eleanor retreated to the kitchen to clean up, grateful to have a door between herself and the rowdy cowboys. She was elbow-deep in dishwater when Quincy appeared in the doorway. "Miss Webb, those Circle K boys are getting out of hand," he said quietly. "I am going to have a word with them. Wanted you to know so you do not worry if you hear raised voices." "Is that wise?" Eleanor asked, drying her hands on her apron. "There are 3 of them." "I have handled worse odds," Quincy said with a slight smile. "Besides, Mr. Hoskins and the Garrett brothers will back me if needed. This is a respectable house, and those men need to remember that." Eleanor watched anxiously from the kitchen doorway as Quincy approached the table where the 3 cowboys sat. She could not hear every word, but she heard enough. Quincy's voice was calm but firm as he explained that this was a respectable establishment, that their behavior was unacceptable, and that they were welcome to stay if they could conduct themselves properly, but if not, they would need to find other accommodations. The red-bearded man stood up, swaying slightly, and for a moment Eleanor feared violence. But Quincy did not back down. He stood his ground, and something in his steady gaze and quiet confidence seemed to penetrate even the man's drunken belligerence. After a tense moment, the cowboy sat back down, muttering an apology. "We meant no disrespect," one of the others said. "We will keep it down." "See that you do," Quincy replied. When Quincy returned to the kitchen, Eleanor realized she had been holding her breath. "Thank you," she said softly. "I did not know what to do." "You did fine, Miss Webb. Sometimes men just need to be reminded of their manners." He paused, then added, "If you like, I can sleep down here in the front room tonight just to make sure there is no trouble." "I could not ask you to do that," Eleanor protested. "You work hard all day. You need your rest." "I am offering, not being asked," Quincy said gently. "And I would rest easier knowing you feel safe. Mrs. Patterson trusted you with her house. I figure the least I can do is make sure nothing happens to disturb that trust." Eleanor felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. "Then I accept your offer with gratitude, Quincy. Thank you." That night, knowing Quincy was downstairs, Eleanor slept more soundly than she had since arriving in Las Vegas. The Circle K cowboys caused no further trouble and left the following morning, and life at the boarding house returned to its normal rhythm. But something had shifted between Eleanor and Quincy. They began to talk more during meals, to exchange observations and opinions. Eleanor learned that Quincy had been working ranches since he was 15, that he had been born in Missouri, but drifted west after his parents died of fever when he was 17. He had worked hard, saved his money, and dreamed of one day owning his own piece of land. "Not a big spread," he told her one evening as they sat on the front porch after supper. "Just enough for a few head of cattle and some horses. A place to call my own, you know, something permanent." "That sounds wonderful," Eleanor said. "Do you think you will stay in New Mexico or move on eventually?" "I like it here," Quincy said thoughtfully. "The land is hard, but it is honest. You get out of it what you put into it, and there is something satisfying about that. Besides, a man gets tired of drifting after a while. Eventually, you want roots." Eleanor understood that sentiment all too well. She had not chosen to come to Las Vegas, but now that she was here, she found herself hoping to make a life in this place, despite its challenges. Quincy, for his part, found himself thinking about Eleanor Webb at odd moments during his workday. He admired her resilience, her intelligence, the way she faced hardship without complaint. He began to imagine a future that included her, though he cautioned himself against moving too quickly. A woman in Eleanor's position would be wary of men's intentions, and Quincy wanted her to know that his interest was genuine and honorable. When Mrs. Patterson returned from Santa Fe, she was pleased to find the boarding house in perfect order and full of praise for Eleanor's management. She also noticed, with the keen eye of a woman who had lived long and seen much, the way Quincy Shepherd and Eleanor Webb looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. "That young man is sweet on you, Mrs. Patterson remarked to Eleanor one afternoon as they kneaded bread together in the kitchen. Eleanor felt her face flush. "I am sure I do not know what you mean, Mrs. Patterson." "Oh, do not play coy with me, girl. I have eyes, and I have seen the way you look at him, too." The older woman's expression grew serious. "Quincy Shepherd is a good man, Eleanor, one of the best I have known. He is honest, hardworking, and he treats people with respect. If he has taken a shine to you, you could do far worse." "I am not in a position to think about such things," Eleanor said quietly. "I have no family, no prospects, and a reputation that is already questionable in this town. What would a man like Quincy want with someone like me?" "A man like Quincy wants a woman with character, intelligence, and courage," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "All of which you possess in abundance. Do not sell yourself short, Eleanor Webb. You are worth more than you think." Eleanor wanted to believe those words, but the judgment she had faced from Reverend Carmichael and the sidelong glances she received from certain townspeople had taken their toll. She felt marked, somehow, as a woman who had made questionable choices, even though her only crime had been trying to survive. That Sunday, Eleanor attended services at the First Presbyterian Church, as she did every week. She sat in the back pew, feeling the weight of disapproving stares from some of the more established ladies of the congregation. Reverend Carmichael's sermon that morning was about the importance of maintaining moral standards and the dangers of allowing impropriety to take root in a community. "We must be vigilant," the Reverend intoned, his voice carrying through the small church, "against those who would undermine our values. A woman without proper family connections, without a husband to guide her, is a potential source of disruption. The Lord established the natural order for a reason, and we ignore it at our peril." Eleanor felt every word like a lash. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded in her lap, and tried to maintain her composure. She knew the Reverend was speaking about her, even if he did not use her name. She had become, in his eyes, an example of what happened when women failed to follow the prescribed path. When the service ended, Eleanor rose quickly, hoping to slip out before having to endure any pointed conversations. But Quincy was waiting for her outside, his hat in his hands. "Miss Webb, might I walk you back to the boarding house?" he asked. "You need not trouble yourself, Quincy," Eleanor said, though in truth she was grateful for the offer. "It is no trouble at all," he replied, offering his arm. They walked in silence for a few moments, and then Quincy said, "That was a hard sermon to sit through." "It is no more than what I deserve, I suppose," Eleanor said quietly. "I made choices that brought me here, and I must accept the consequences." Quincy stopped walking and turned to face her. "Eleanor, may I speak plainly?" she nodded, surprised by the intensity in his eyes. "Reverend Carmichael is a learned man in matters of Scripture, but he is a fool when it comes to understanding people," Quincy said. "You did nothing wrong. You tried to make a life for yourself in the only way available to you. That takes courage, not moral failing." "The Reverend would say that I should have had more faith, trusted in the Lord's provision," Eleanor said. "Faith does not put food on the table or a roof over your head," Quincy replied. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," my mother used to say. "You helped yourself. You showed strength and determination, Anyone who cannot see that is blind. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. You are very kind, Quincy. I am not being kind, I am being honest. He hesitated, then added, Eleanor, I know this might not be the right time, and you are certainly free to tell me I am speaking out of turn, but I need you to know something. I have come to care for you a great deal. More than I probably should, considering we have only known each other a few months. But what I feel is real, and it is honorable. I am not a rich man, but I work hard, and I am saving for that piece of land I told you about. I could provide for a wife, if she were willing to build something with me. Eleanor stared at him, her heart pounding. Quincy, are you asking what I think you are asking? I am saying that I would like to court you properly, with the intention of marriage if you find me suitable, Quincy said. I know your situation is complicated, and I know some folks in this town have made judgments about you, but I do not care about any of that. I care about you, Eleanor, about who you are, not what circumstances brought you here. Eleanor felt a tangle of emotions. Hope, fear, longing, and caution all warred within her. Quincy, I care for you too, more than I thought possible, but I worry about what this would mean for you. Associating with me, courting me, it could affect your reputation, your standing in the community. Let it, Quincy said with quiet conviction. I will not let the opinions of small-minded people dictate who I spend my life with. If you are willing to take a chance on me, Eleanor, I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy and to build a good life for us. Eleanor looked into his blue eyes and saw only sincerity and strength. For the first time since arriving in Las Vegas, she felt truly seen, truly valued. Then yes, Quincy, I would be honored to be courted by you. Quincy's face broke into a wide smile. He took her hand and squeezed it gently. You have made me very happy, Eleanor Webb. They continued walking back to the boarding house, and Eleanor felt as though she were floating. The harsh judgment of Reverend Carmichael and the disapproving stares of the townspeople suddenly seemed less important. She had found someone who saw her worth, who valued her for who she was. That was a rare and precious gift. Mrs. Patterson was delighted when Eleanor told her the news. I knew it, she said with satisfaction. I knew that boy had good sense, and you are a lucky woman, Eleanor. Quincy Shepherd will treat you right. But not everyone in Las Vegas was pleased by the development. Word spread quickly that Quincy Shepherd was courting Eleanor Webb, and the reaction was mixed. Some people, particularly those who knew Quincy and respected him, were happy for the couple. But others, influenced by Reverend Carmichael's subtle but persistent disapproval of Eleanor, saw the courtship as evidence of poor judgment on Quincy's part. The situation came to a head 3 weeks later, when Quincy approached Reverend Carmichael to discuss the possibility of marriage. It was customary for couples to meet with the minister before making formal plans, and Quincy wanted to do things properly, despite his private misgivings about the Reverend's attitude toward Eleanor. The meeting took place in the Reverend's study, a small room lined with theological texts and smelling of old paper and beeswax. Reverend Carmichael listened in stony silence as Quincy explained his intentions. So you wish to marry Eleanor Webb, the Reverend said when Quincy finished. It was not a question. I do, sir. I love her, and she has agreed to be my wife. We would like to be married here in the church if you will perform the ceremony. Reverend Carmichael leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Mr. Shepherd, I have known you for the 3 years you have been in Las Vegas. You have always struck me as a sensible, God-fearing young man. That is why I feel compelled to speak honestly with you now. I appreciate honesty, Reverend, Quincy said, though he felt a knot forming in his stomach. Miss Webb is not a suitable wife for a man of your character, the Reverend said bluntly. She arrived in this town under questionable circumstances, having agreed to marry a man she had never met. That demonstrates a fundamental lack of judgment and propriety. She has no family, no connections, and her reputation is already compromised. You would be tying yourself to a woman who will be a source of gossip and speculation for years to come. Quincy felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice level. With respect, Reverend, Eleanor made the choices she made out of necessity, not immorality. She was facing destitution and took the only path available to her. That takes courage, not moral failing. A woman of true faith would have trusted in the Lord's provision rather than resorting to such desperate measures, the Reverend countered. Furthermore, Mr. Shepherd, you must consider the practical implications. You are a man with aspirations, I understand. You wish to own land, to establish yourself in this community. A wife with a questionable background will be a hindrance to those goals. She will not be welcomed into the better circles of society. Your children will bear the stigma of their mother's reputation. I do not care about the better circles of society, Quincy said, his voice hardening. I care about building a life with a woman I love and respect. Eleanor is intelligent, hardworking, and possessed of more genuine character than half the so-called respectable people in this town. If society cannot see that, then society is the one with the problem. Reverend Carmichael's expression grew stern. You are being reckless, Mr. Shepherd. I strongly advise you to reconsider this courtship. If you will not, then I must tell you that I cannot in good conscience perform a marriage ceremony for you and Miss Webb. To do so would be to give my blessing to a union that I believe to be fundamentally mismatched and unwise. Quincy stood up, his jaw tight. Then I will find someone else to perform the ceremony, Reverend. And I will tell you this, I believe you are wrong, dead wrong. You claim to represent a God of love and mercy, but all I see from you is judgment and condemnation. Eleanor Webb is worth 10 of the people you consider respectable. If you cannot see that, then I pity you. Careful, Mr. Shepherd, the Reverend warned. Pride goes before a fall. And judgment without mercy is a sin, Quincy replied. Good day, Reverend. He walked out of the study and did not look back. When Eleanor heard what had happened, she was devastated. Quincy, I cannot let you sacrifice your place in the community for me, she said, tears streaming down her face. The Reverend is right. I will be a burden to you. People will always look at me with suspicion, and that will reflect on you and any children we might have. They were sitting in the small parlor of the boarding house, and Quincy took both of Eleanor's hands in his. Listen to me, Eleanor. I have thought about this long and hard, and my mind is made up. I would rather have a life with you, facing whatever judgments narrow-minded people want to throw at us, than a life without you in some false respectability. You are the woman I love. You are the woman I want to build a future with. The Reverend's opinion does not change that. But where will we be married? Eleanor asked. If Reverend Carmichael will not perform the ceremony and he is the only minister in Las Vegas. There is a traveling circuit preacher who comes through the territory, Quincy said. Reverend Thomas Holbrook. He preaches to the ranchers and the smaller settlements that do not have established churches. I have heard him speak a few times, and he strikes me as a man with more compassion than judgment. I will find him and ask if he would be willing to perform our ceremony. You would do that for me, Eleanor whispered. I would do anything for you, Quincy said simply. It took Quincy 2 weeks to track down Reverend Holbrook. The circuit preacher was camped near a settlement 30 miles south of Las Vegas, and Quincy rode out on a Saturday to speak with him. He found the preacher to be a man in his early 40s, weathered by years of traveling rough country, with kind eyes and a warm smile. Quincy explained the situation honestly. holding nothing back about Eleanor's circumstances or Reverend Carmichael's refusal to marry them. Reverend Holbrook listened carefully, occasionally asking questions. When Quincy finished, the preacher was quiet for a moment, gazing out at the vast New Mexico landscape. "Tell me, Mr. Shepherd," he said finally, "why do you love this woman?" Quincy thought about the question. "Because she is brave," he said. "Because she faces hardship without complaint. Because she is kind and intelligent and hardworking. Because when I am with her, I feel like the man I want to be. Because I cannot imagine building a life with anyone else." "And you believe your love for each other comes from an honest place, a place of genuine connection and respect." "I do, Reverend. More than I have ever believed anything in my life." Reverend Holbrook nodded slowly. "Then I will perform your ceremony, Mr. Shepherd." "I do not believe the Lord is particularly concerned with the opinions of men who judge others by their circumstances rather than their character. If your hearts are true to each other and to God, then who am I to deny you the blessing of marriage?" Relief flooded through Quincy. "Thank you, Reverend. You do not know what this means to us." "I will be passing through Las Vegas in 3 weeks," Holbrook said. "I will perform the ceremony then, if that suits you." "That suits us perfectly, sir." When Quincy returned to Las Vegas and told Eleanor the news, she wept with happiness and relief. Mrs. Patterson immediately began planning a small celebration to follow the ceremony, insisting that the couple deserved a proper wedding feast, even if it would be held in a boarding house dining room rather than a church hall. The 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Eleanor worked on altering a dress that Mrs. Patterson generously gave her, a beautiful deep blue silk that had belonged to the proprietress in her younger days. Quincy saved every extra penny from his wages to buy a simple gold ring and to rent a small house on the edge of town, a modest 2-room adobe structure with a well and a small barn. Word of the upcoming wedding spread through Las Vegas, and opinions were divided. Some people were happy for the couple and planned to attend the ceremony. Others, influenced by Reverend Carmichael's disapproval, made their feelings known through cold stares and whispered comments. 2 days before the wedding, Reverend Carmichael himself paid a visit to the boarding house. Eleanor was alone when he arrived, as Quincy was at work and Mrs. Patterson had gone to the market. "Miss Webb, I have come to make one final appeal to your conscience," the Reverend said when Eleanor opened the door. "You are making a grave mistake in pursuing this marriage. Mr. Shepherd is a good man who deserves a wife of impeccable character and standing. By marrying him, you will drag him down. His prospects will be diminished. His reputation will suffer. Is that what you want for a man you claim to love?" Eleanor had spent the past weeks finding her courage, and she drew on it now. "Reverend Carmichael, with all due respect, you do not know me. You have judged me based on circumstances rather than character. You have decided that, because I came to Las Vegas to marry a man I had never met, I am somehow morally deficient. But you do not know what drove me to that choice. You do not know the desperation of being a woman alone with no means of support and no family. You do not know what it is like to choose between starvation and survival." The Reverend's expression remained stern. "Hardship does not excuse impropriety." "Perhaps not in your eyes," Eleanor said, "but I believe in a God who judges hearts, not circumstances, and my heart is true to Quincy. I love him and he loves me. We will build a good life together, based on mutual respect and shared values. If that is not worthy of blessing in your eyes, then I pity your narrow view of grace." For a moment, something flickered in the Reverend's eyes, surprise perhaps or grudging respect. But his expression quickly hardened again. "You are determined to go through with this marriage?" he asked. "I am, Reverend, with or without your approval." "Then I have nothing more to say to you, Miss Webb, but know this, I will be watching. When this union falters, as I believe it will, do not expect sympathy from this community. You will have made your bed, and you will lie in it." "I will make my bed with the man I love," Eleanor said quietly, "and I will consider myself blessed, regardless of what you or anyone else thinks." The Reverend left without another word, and Eleanor closed the door behind him with trembling hands. She had stood up to him, defended herself and her choices, but the encounter had shaken her. Doubts crept in. What if the Reverend was right? What if her presence did harm Quincy's future? What if their children were stigmatized because of her reputation? When Quincy arrived that evening, Eleanor shared her fears with him. He listened patiently, then took her face in his hands. "Eleanor, listen to me. The Reverend is wrong. He is a man so bound by his own ideas of propriety and order that he cannot see the truth standing in front of him. The truth is that you and I were meant to find each other. I do not believe in many coincidences, but I believe in providence. You came to Las Vegas in desperate circumstances, and I happen to be here, ready to see you for who you really are. That is not accident. That is grace." "You sound like a preacher yourself," Eleanor said with a watery smile. "I am just a cowboy who knows what his heart is telling him," Quincy replied. "And my heart says that marrying you is the rightest thing I will ever do. Let heaven judge our hearts, Eleanor. I believe heaven will find them true." Eleanor felt the last of her doubts crumble away. She pulled Quincy close and held him tight, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. The wedding day dawned clear and bright. Reverend Holbrook arrived in Las Vegas as promised, and the ceremony was held in the boarding house parlor, which Mrs. Patterson and several of the regular boarders had decorated with wildflowers and ribbons. The guest list was small but meaningful. Mrs. Patterson, of course, along with Mr. Hoskins, the Garrett brothers, and a handful of other people who had come to know and respect Eleanor and Quincy. Eleanor wore the altered blue silk dress, her hair pinned up with small white flowers. Quincy wore his best clothes, his dark hair neatly combed and his boots polished to a shine. They stood before Reverend Holbrook, holding hands, and spoke their vows with voices that rang with conviction. "Do you, Quincy Shepherd, take this woman, Eleanor Webb, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Reverend Holbrook asked. "I do," Quincy said firmly, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "And do you, Eleanor Webb, take this man, Quincy Shepherd, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Eleanor said, her voice strong despite the tears of happiness streaming down her face. "Then, by the power vested in me and in the sight of God, I pronounce you husband and wife. Quincy, you may kiss your bride." Quincy pulled Eleanor close and kissed her gently, and the small gathering erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a feast of roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from her garden, and a beautiful cake with white frosting. There was music and laughter, and for a few hours, Eleanor forgot all about the judgment and disapproval that had shadowed her time in Las Vegas. She was simply a happy bride, celebrating her wedding day with her beloved husband and the friends who had supported them. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Reverend Holbrook pulled Quincy and Eleanor aside for a private word. "I want you to know something," the preacher said. "The road ahead will not always be easy. There will be people who question your union, who try to make you doubt yourselves. but I have married many couples in my years of traveling this territory, and I can tell you this. What matters is not what others think. What matters is the truth between you, the commitment you make to each other every single day. Keep your hearts true, love each other well, and you will build something lasting and beautiful. Thank you, Reverend, Eleanor said, for believing in us when others would not. I believe in the God who sees hearts, Holbrook replied with a smile. And your hearts are good. Now go, begin your life together, and may the Lord bless you with many years of happiness. Quincy and Eleanor walked through the quiet streets of Las Vegas to their little rented house, hand in hand under the vast New Mexico sky. The stars were brilliant overhead, countless points of light in the darkness, and Eleanor felt as though she were walking into a future full of promise. The house was modest, but Quincy had worked hard to make it welcoming. There was a bed with a handmade quilt, a table and chairs, a stove and curtains in the windows. It was not much, but it was theirs. "Welcome home, Mrs. Shepherd," Quincy said, lifting Eleanor over the threshold. Eleanor laughed with pure joy. "Mrs. Shepherd, I like the sound of that." They spent their first night as husband and wife talking and dreaming about the future they would build together. Quincy shared his plans for the land he wanted to buy, describing the valley he had his eye on, with good grass and a year-round stream. Eleanor talked about the garden she wanted to plant, the books she wanted to read, the life she wanted to create. "I never thought I would be this happy," Eleanor whispered as they lay together in the darkness. "After everything that happened, after feeling so lost and alone, I never imagined I would find this." "We found each other," Quincy said, pulling her close. "That is all that matters." The weeks and months that followed were not without challenges. Reverend Carmichael continued to make his disapproval known, occasionally preaching sermons that seemed aimed directly at Eleanor and Quincy's marriage. Some of the more established families in Las Vegas remained cool toward the couple, and there were invitations that never came, gatherings to which they were not invited. But Eleanor and Quincy found that their happiness was not dependent on the approval of others. They built a life centered on their love for each other, their shared work, and the friendships they cultivated with people who valued character over social standing. Quincy continued working at the Double S Ranch, saving every penny he could toward his dream of owning land. Eleanor took in sewing and mending work to supplement their income, her reputation as a skilled seamstress gradually spreading through the community. Mrs. Patterson remained a close friend and frequent visitor, and her vocal support of the couple helped to gradually shift public opinion in their favor. A year after their wedding, Quincy came home with news that made Eleanor's heart soar. "I have found it," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "The perfect piece of land. 40 acres in that valley I told you about with a stream and good grazing. The owner is willing to sell for a fair price, and I have saved almost enough for the down payment. If we can come up with another $50, we can make an offer." $50, Eleanor said thoughtfully. She went to the small trunk where she kept her sewing money and pulled out a cloth bag. "I have been saving too, Quincy. I have $30 here. We are closer than you think." Quincy looked at the bag in amazement. "Eleanor, I had no idea you had saved so much. I wanted to surprise you," she said with a smile. "I wanted to help make your dream come true." They pooled their resources and, with a small loan from Mrs. Patterson, managed to secure the land. The day Quincy signed the deed, he held the paper as though it were made of gold. "This is ours, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our land, our future." They moved into a small cabin on the property, even more modest than the house they had been renting, but situated in a beautiful valley with mountains rising in the distance. Quincy began the hard work of building up a small herd, buying a few head of cattle and some horses. Eleanor planted a garden and chickens, transforming the area around the cabin into a productive homestead. The work was backbreaking, and there were times when Eleanor wondered if they had taken on more than they could handle. But Quincy's determination was unwavering, and his optimism was contagious. Slowly, steadily, they built something real and lasting. 2 years after their wedding, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news filled both her and Quincy with joy and a certain amount of terror. They were far from town, far from easy access to a doctor, and childbirth in the New Mexico territory in 1880 was not without risks. But Eleanor approached the pregnancy with the same quiet courage she had shown in facing every other challenge. She read everything she could find about childbirth and infant care. Mrs. Patterson, who had assisted with many births in her long life, promised to come and stay with them when Eleanor's time drew near. The baby came on a cold February morning in 1881. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Eleanor wondered if she would survive it. But with Mrs. Patterson's experienced guidance and Quincy's steady presence, she brought a healthy baby boy into the world. They named him Thomas Holbrook Shepherd after the circuit preacher who had believed in them when others would not. Quincy held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Eleanor, he is absolutely perfect." "He is ours," Eleanor said, exhausted but glowing with happiness. "Our family, Quincy." Parenthood transformed them both. Quincy became even more determined to make their ranch successful, working from dawn to dusk to ensure his family's security. Eleanor proved to be a capable and loving mother, managing the household and caring for Thomas while still contributing to the ranch work whenever she could. When Thomas was 6 months old, Eleanor and Quincy made the journey into Las Vegas for supplies. It was the first time they had been back to town since moving to their land, and Eleanor was nervous about how they would be received. To her surprise, the reception was warmer than she had expected. People stopped to admire baby Thomas and to congratulate the couple. Even some of the families who had previously kept their distance seemed to soften at the sight of the healthy, happy baby. The one exception was Reverend Carmichael. When Eleanor and Quincy attended Sunday services with Thomas, the Reverend's expression remained stony. But Eleanor noticed something that gave her hope. Several members of the congregation went out of their way to greet the young family warmly, and one elderly woman, Mrs. Harriet Donovan, made a point of sitting next to Eleanor during the service. "That is a beautiful baby you have there, Mrs." Donovan whispered. "You and your husband should be very proud." "Thank you," Eleanor whispered back, feeling a lump form in her throat. After the service, as people filed out, Mrs. Donovan stopped Reverend Carmichael at the door. Eleanor was close enough to overhear the conversation. "Reverend, I have been a member of this congregation for 20 years, Mrs. Donovan said in a voice that carried surprising authority for a woman of her small stature. "And in that time, I have watched you guide many couples through marriage and family life. But I must tell you, I believe you have been in error regarding Mr. and Mrs. Shepherd." The Reverend's eyebrows rose. "Mrs. Donovan, I hardly think this is the time or place." "This is exactly the time and place," Mrs. Donovan interrupted. "That young couple has worked hard, built a life together, and raised a beautiful child. They have faced hardship and judgment with grace and dignity. They attend services regularly. They conduct themselves with propriety and honor. What more could you ask of any couple? And yet you continue to treat them with coldness and disapproval. It is unbecoming of a man of God, Reverend, and it is driving people away from this church." Several other congregation members had stopped to listen, and Eleanor saw some of them nodding in agreement with Mrs. Donovan's words. Reverend Carmichael's face reddened. I have always acted according to my conscience and my understanding of Scripture, Mrs. Donovan. Then perhaps your conscience needs examining, Mrs. Donovan said tartly. The Bible speaks of grace and mercy, Reverend. It speaks of loving your neighbor and not judging. Perhaps you should spend more time reflecting on those teachings and less time pronouncing judgment on young people who are trying their best to live good lives. With that, Mrs. Donovan took Eleanor's arm and walked out of the church, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Outside, Eleanor turned to the elderly woman with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Donovan, you did not have to do that. I do not want to cause division in the church. My dear, you did not cause anything, Mrs. Donovan said firmly. Reverend Carmichael's stubbornness caused it. I have held my tongue for too long, watching him treat you and your husband with unjust severity. It was time someone spoke up. Now, where are you and that handsome husband of yours living? I would like to visit sometime and see how you are doing. Eleanor gave Mrs. Donovan directions to their ranch, and the elderly woman promised to call on them soon. True to her word, Mrs. Donovan visited a few weeks later, bringing a hand-knitted blanket for Thomas and spending a pleasant afternoon sharing stories and advice. The confrontation with Reverend Carmichael had an unexpected effect. Other members of the congregation, emboldened by Mrs. Donovan's stand, began to openly welcome Eleanor and Quincy. Invitations to social gatherings began to arrive. People stopped by the ranch to visit and to see how the young family was doing. Even more surprisingly, Reverend Carmichael himself seemed to soften somewhat. He did not apologize directly, but his sermons became less focused on judgment and more on grace. When Eleanor and Quincy brought Thomas to be baptized a year later, the Reverend performed the ceremony without complaint and with what Eleanor thought might have been a hint of genuine warmth. Life on the ranch continued to improve. Quincy's careful management and hard work paid off, and their cattle herd grew steadily. They were able to build a larger, more comfortable house to replace the original cabin. Eleanor's garden flourished, and she sold surplus vegetables and preserves in town, adding to their income. When Thomas was 3 years old, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Grace Elizabeth Shepherd. The birth was easier than Thomas's had been, and Eleanor recovered quickly. Quincy was delighted to have a daughter, and Thomas took to his role as big brother with endearing seriousness. The children grew up surrounded by the raw beauty of the New Mexico landscape, learning early to ride horses, to help with ranch work, and to appreciate the value of hard work and perseverance. Eleanor taught them to read and write, using books that she ordered from Santa Fe and that arrived on the occasional supply wagon. Quincy taught them about the land, about how to read the weather and the seasons, about treating animals with respect and care. He also taught them about honor, honesty, and the importance of judging people by their character rather than their circumstances. Your mother faced hard times with courage, Quincy told Thomas and Grace one evening as they sat around the dinner table. She could have given up, could have made easier choices that would have compromised who she was, but she stayed true to herself, and she fought for a better life. That is something to be proud of. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed Quincy's hand, her eyes glistening with tears. Even after years of marriage, his steadfast support and love for her never failed to move her deeply. The years passed, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and family milestones. Thomas grew into a tall, serious boy who loved the ranch and dreamed of expanding it someday. Grace was spirited and curious, always asking questions and exploring every corner of their property. When Eleanor was 30 years old and Quincy was 34, they welcomed another son into the world, whom they named James Patrick Shepherd. The ranch was prosperous enough now that they could afford to hire a hand to help with the work, and life felt more secure than Eleanor had ever imagined possible during those desperate days when she first arrived in Las Vegas. One Sunday after services, Reverend Carmichael approached Eleanor and Quincy as they were loading the children into their wagon. "Mr. and Mrs. Shepherd, might I have a word?" the Reverend asked. Eleanor felt a familiar tension knot her stomach, but Quincy simply nodded. "Of course, Reverend." Carmichael was silent for a moment, seeming to struggle with something. Finally, he said, "I owe you an apology, both of you. I treated you with harsh judgment when you deserved compassion and support. I told myself I was acting according to principle, but I now see that I was acting according to pride and a narrow understanding of grace." Eleanor stared at him in shock. Quincy seemed equally surprised. "I have watched you build a life together," the Reverend continued. "I have watched you raise your children with love and wisdom. I have watched you contribute to this community with generosity and kindness. You have proven me wrong in every way that matters. I hope you can forgive an old man's stubbornness." Eleanor felt tears pricking her eyes. "Of course we forgive you, Reverend. Thank you for saying that. It needed to be said," Carmichael replied. "I hope I have not caused lasting harm." "You have not," Quincy said, though there was still a hint of reserve in his voice. "We have built a good life and we hold no bitterness." After the Reverend walked away, Eleanor turned to Quincy. "Can you believe that?" "I am not sure I can," Quincy admitted, "but I am glad he said it, for his sake as much as ours." As they drove back to the ranch, with the children chattering happily in the back of the wagon, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Las Vegas 8 years ago, with nothing but a carpet bag and a letter from a dead man. She thought about the desperation and fear she had felt, the judgment she had faced, the uncertainty of those early days. And she thought about Quincy, the cowboy who had looked past her circumstances and seen her heart, the man who had defied convention and judgment to build a life with her, the husband who had proven, day after day and year after year, that love based on character and mutual respect could weather any storm. "What are you thinking about?" Quincy asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About how lucky I am," Eleanor said simply. "About how close I came to missing all of this. About how grateful I am that you saw something in me worth fighting for." "I saw everything in you worth fighting for," Quincy said, reaching over to take her hand. "And I have never regretted it for a single moment." The ranch continued to prosper over the next decade. Quincy gradually increased their land holdings, purchasing an adjacent 40 acres and then another 20 beyond that. They built a barn, a proper bunkhouse for the 3 hands they now employed, and a smokehouse. Eleanor's garden expanded to include fruit trees and berry bushes, and she became known throughout the area for her preserves and baked goods. Thomas grew into a capable young man who shared his father's love of the land and his mother's quiet strength. When he was 18, he began courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sensible girl named Sarah who reminded Eleanor of herself at that age. Grace, at 15, had inherited Eleanor's intelligence and her father's determination. She wanted to become a teacher, and Eleanor and Quincy supported that dream, setting aside money to send her to the Territorial Normal School in Santa Fe when the time came. Young James, at 10, was still figuring out who he wanted to be, but he had a gentle way with animals that suggested he might become a veterinarian if such training became available to him. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Quincy surprised Eleanor with a gift he had been planning for months. He led her outside to where a new structure stood near the house, a small building with windows on all sides. "What is this?" Eleanor asked, puzzled. "Open the door and look inside," Quincy said with a smile. Eleanor pushed open the door and gasped. The interior had been fitted out as a library, with shelves lining the walls and a comfortable chair by the window. And the shelves were filled with books, dozens of them, more books than Eleanor had ever owned. "Quincy, this must have cost a fortune," she breathed. "You have spent 15 years helping me build my dream," Quincy said softly. "I wanted to give you something for yours. I know you have always loved reading, and I thought you should have a place to do it in peace." Eleanor threw her arms around her husband, tears streaming down her face. "It is perfect. You are perfect. I love you so much." "I love you too, Eleanor, more than I can ever put into words." They stood there in the doorway of the little library, holding each other as the sun set over the New Mexico landscape, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Life continued its steady rhythm. Thomas married Sarah in a beautiful ceremony at the church in Las Vegas, with Reverend Carmichael performing the service. The Reverend had become, if not a close friend, then at least a respectful acquaintance who had learned from his past mistakes. Grace went off to normal school in Santa Fe, writing long letters home about her studies and her dreams of teaching in rural communities. James discovered a talent for training horses and began to build a reputation in the territory for his skill. Eleanor and Quincy, now in their 40s, found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other's company. They took long rides across their land, talking about everything and nothing. They sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the stars and marveling at the life they had built. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if Mr. Whitmore had not died?" Quincy asked one evening. Eleanor considered the question. "Sometimes. I imagine it would have been comfortable but empty. A marriage of convenience with a man I did not love. I would have had security, perhaps, but not happiness." "You think you would have been content with that?" "I do not know. I suppose I would have made the best of it, as women do, but I cannot imagine it now. I cannot imagine a life without you, without our children, without all of this." She gestured to the ranch spread out before them in the twilight. "I am glad Mr. Whitmore died," Quincy said, then laughed at the shocked look on Eleanor's face. "That sounds terrible, I know, but if he had lived, I would never have met you. And you are the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor Shepherd. The very best thing." Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Let heaven judge our hearts," she murmured, remembering the words Quincy had spoken so many years ago when Reverend Carmichael had declared them mismatched. "Heaven has judged our hearts," Quincy replied, "and found them true." When Eleanor was 48 and Quincy was 52, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Thomas and Sarah had given them 4 grandchildren, 2 boys and 2 girls. Grace had married a fellow teacher and had twin daughters. James, now 25, had recently become engaged to a young woman from Santa Fe. The celebration was held at the ranch, with friends and neighbors coming from miles around. Even Reverend Carmichael attended, now in his 80s and retired, his place at the church taken by a younger minister who had known Eleanor and Quincy only as respected members of the community. As Eleanor looked around at the gathering, at the faces of the people who filled her life with love and meaning, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey from desperate mail-order bride to matriarch of a thriving family had not been easy, but it had been worth every challenge, every hardship, every moment of doubt. That evening, as the last guests departed and the grandchildren were settled for the night, Eleanor and Quincy walked out to the small library he had built for her so many years ago. The moon was full, casting silver light across the valley, and the air was sweet with the scent of sage and wildflowers. 30 years, Eleanor said softly. Can you believe it has been 30 years? Best 30 years of my life, Quincy replied. Though you have given me far more gray hair than I expected, Eleanor laughed. You have given me a few gray hairs yourself, Quincy Shepherd. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Quincy said, I have been thinking about the preacher. About Reverend Carmichael and what he said to us all those years ago. That we were mismatched, Eleanor asked. Yes, I remember being so angry at him, but now, looking back, I almost feel grateful. Because his judgment, his certainty that we were wrong for each other, it made me more determined than ever to prove him wrong. It made me more committed to building a life with you that would demonstrate beyond any doubt that character matters more than circumstances. And did we prove him wrong? Eleanor asked with a smile. I think we did, Quincy said. I think we proved that love based on respect, partnership, and genuine connection can overcome any amount of outside judgment. We built something real, Eleanor, something lasting, something worth fighting for. Yes, Eleanor agreed. We did. They remained in the library for a long time that night, talking about the past and dreaming about the future. They talked about their hopes for their children and grandchildren, about the changes they had seen in the New Mexico territory over the decades, about the legacy they hoped to leave behind. I want them to remember that we were happy, Eleanor said. That despite everything, despite the hardships and the judgments and the struggles, we were truly, deeply happy. They will remember, Quincy assured her, because it is the truth. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow as years do. They lost Mrs. Patterson, who passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87. They said goodbye to Reverend Carmichael, who died a few months later, having made his peace with his past mistakes. They celebrated the births of more grandchildren and, eventually, great-grandchildren. Quincy's health began to decline when he was in his late 60s. Years of hard physical labor had taken their toll on his body, and he developed arthritis that made it increasingly difficult for him to work the ranch. But he refused to complain, and he remained actively involved in managing the operation even as Thomas took on more of the day-to-day responsibilities. Eleanor cared for Quincy with the same dedication and love he had always shown her. She made sure he took the medicines the doctor prescribed, prepared special meals to tempt his sometimes flagging appetite, and spent long hours sitting with him, talking or reading aloud from the books in her library. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from their porch, Quincy took Eleanor's hand. I need to tell you something, he said softly. Eleanor felt a chill of fear. What is it? I need you to know that my life has been everything I hoped it would be and more. Because of you, Eleanor. Because you took a chance on a cowboy who had nothing but a dream and a determination to love you well. Quincy, you are scaring me, Eleanor said, though tears were already forming in her eyes. Do not be scared. I am not going anywhere anytime soon if I have anything to say about it. I just wanted you to know, in case I do not say it enough. You are the love of my life, Eleanor Shepherd. You always have been and you always will be. Eleanor leaned over and kissed him gently. And you are mine, Quincy. My love, my partner, my best friend. Everything I am, everything we built together, it is all because you saw something worth loving in a desperate woman who stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but a carpet bag and a broken dream. I saw everything, Quincy said. I saw courage and strength and beauty. I saw the woman I wanted to spend my life with, and I have never, for one single moment, regretted that choice. Quincy lived for another 5 years, passing away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72 with Eleanor holding his hand. The entire community turned out for his funeral. a testament to the respect and affection he had earned over his decades in New Mexico. Eleanor grieved deeply for her husband, but she found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the legacy they had built together, and in the memories of a love that had defied expectations and flourished against all odds. She lived for another 8 years, remaining active and engaged with her family and community. She spent her days reading in the library Quincy had built for her, working in her garden, and telling stories to her great-grandchildren about their grandfather and the life they had built together. On a warm summer evening in 1916, Eleanor Webb Shepherd passed away at the age of 80, surrounded by 3 generations of the family she and Quincy had created. She died with a smile on her face, having lived a life filled with love, purpose, and deep satisfaction. At her funeral, her granddaughter Grace, now a teacher and writer, spoke about Eleanor's legacy. "My grandmother came to New Mexico with nothing," Grace said. "She was judged harshly by people who did not know her, who saw only her circumstances and not her character. But she and my grandfather built a life together that proved love and determination can overcome any obstacle. They taught us that what matters is not where you start, but who you choose to be. They showed us that true partnership, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, is the foundation of lasting happiness. And they demonstrated that heaven judges hearts, not circumstances. Their hearts were true, and they built something beautiful together. That is the legacy we inherit, and it is a precious gift." The ranch that Quincy and Eleanor built together remained in the family for generations, passed down through Thomas's line. The little library Quincy built for Eleanor was preserved as a family treasure, and it still stands today, filled with the books Eleanor loved and the journals she kept, documenting the remarkable journey from mail order bride to beloved matriarch. In the small cemetery outside Las Vegas, 2 headstones stand side by side. One reads, "Quincy Samuel Shepherd, 1851–1923, beloved husband, father, and grandfather. He judged hearts, not circumstances." The other reads, "Eleanor Webb Shepherd, 1856–1936, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She faced life with courage and grace." Between the 2 headstones, carved into a small marker, are the words that became the family's motto. "Let heaven judge our hearts." And heaven, in its wisdom and mercy, had found those hearts true, just as Quincy had always believed it would. Their love story became legend in the New Mexico territory, a reminder that true love recognizes character over circumstance, that courage can overcome judgment, and that a life built on genuine partnership and mutual respect is the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind. The preacher had said they were mismatched, but Quincy had known better. He had looked into Eleanor's green eyes and seen not a desperate woman making questionable choices, but a strong, intelligent, determined person worthy of love and respect. And he had been right. Their 38 years together had been a testament to the power of love that sees beyond surface circumstances, to the truth of the human heart. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the judgments of narrow-minded people, not the disapproval of those who valued social standing over character, not the hardships and challenges they had faced. What mattered was that they had loved each other well, raised their children with wisdom and affection, built something lasting and meaningful, and left a legacy that would inspire generations to come. Heaven had indeed judged their hearts and found them perfectly matched after all.